All right, welcome to Talk Testimonies. You know we love to get into the weeds with you all in these Supreme Court cases, and today we've got one that's pretty fascinating. It really boils down to the power of states to regulate what happens within their borders, specifically focusing on the sale of alcohol.
Ooh, yeah, this one is interesting.
We're talking about a challenge to a specific state law in Tennessee that says, hey, you have to live in the state for a set amount of time before you can get a license to sell liquor. It's called the durational residency requirement.
Right.
So before we get into the back and forth between the justices and the lawyers, let's give everyone the bottom line up front. The core question here is, are these residency rules constitutional? Can states actually do this?
Exactly. And it's a tougher question than you might think at first glance.
Yeah, it really gets to the heart of how much power states have to control industries and businesses within their own territory.
And how that power bumps up against the free flow of commerce across state lines, which is kind of a bedrock principle in the U.S.
For sure. So let's set the stage a bit. The lawyers for Tennessee, they're the respondents in this case because they're defending the law. They came out strong, arguing that these residency requirements are actually protected from the usual scrutiny we apply to state laws that might, mess with interstate commerce. We often call that the dormant commerce clause.
Yeah, like if a state tries to give its own businesses a huge advantage over companies from other states, there's a whole legal framework to examine whether that's even allowed.
Right. But Tennessee is saying, hold on, alcohol is different.
Mm-hmm.
And they're basing that on a couple of things. First, they point to some old federal laws, the Wilson and Webb Canyon Acts.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, these laws gave states more authority over alcohol even before Prohibition kicked in.
Mm.
And then they also argue that these kinds of residency laws have been around for a long time, even back when the Constitution was being ratified.
Mm.
So their position is, this is well established, this is how we've always done things.
So they're using both legal precedent and historical practice to support their case.
Precisely. Now, Justice Sotomayor was having none of this right off the bat. She jumped in and raised a big concern.
Big comeback.
She basically said, if we give states this much leeway with alcohol, couldn't they just create all sorts of barriers for out-of-state businesses? Could they say no out-of-state wholesalers, no distributors from other states, even no retailers at all if they're not from here, just to protect their own local businesses?
Right. That would be classic economic protectionism. States trying to wall themselves off to keep all the economic activity for themselves.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is, the respondent's lawyer essentially said, yeah, we don't think there's an economic protectionism exception to the broad authority that states have under the 21st Amendment.
Wait, so they're saying the 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition and gave states power to regulate alcohol, trumps concerns about protectionism.
It seems that way, at least according to their argument. And Justice Sotomayor was like, whoa, hold on a second. She then got into the weeds on the specifics of Tennessee's law. So it's not just some residency requirement. The law actually has two parts, a 2-year requirement and a 10-year requirement.
Wow, 10 years. That's a long time.
Yeah, and Sotomayor really pressed the state's lawyer on this, saying you're essentially making people wait 12 years. And she wanted a solid justification for that 10-year part. What's the real purpose? What does it actually achieve?
It does seem like they're really stacking the deck against anyone trying to move to Tennessee and open a liquor store.
Yeah. And there was also some back and forth about whether you could just chop off the 10-year part and leave the 2-year requirement. That's what we call severability in legal terms.
Right. Could you sever those two parts and still have a constitutional law?
Exactly. Now, Justice Alito, he comes in with a very direct question.
Okay.
He's basically asking, could a state just enact a 10-year residency rule and get away with it under the Dormant Commerce Clause?
I see. He's trying to isolate that 10-year requirement and see if it stands on its own.
Yeah. And the respondent's lawyer admitted that, well, it might not be a problem under the Commerce Clause, specifically because of the 21st Amendment. There could be other constitutional challenges.
But even they acknowledge there might be some limits, even with the 21st Amendment.
For sure. Then the conversation took an interesting turn. They started talking about a previous Supreme Court case, Bacchus Imports, LTD v. Dias. Now, this case was about a Hawaiian tax break for alcoholic beverages that were produced locally.
Yeah.
And the court struck that down, say it was discriminatory.
Okay.
So now the justices are trying to figure out, was the rule in Bacchus based on a general principle against economic protectionism, like we were talking about before, or was it specifically about discrimination against out-of-state products? That distinction is really important.
I see, yeah. Are we talking about a broad principle or a more narrow rule?
Right. And Justice Sotomayor, she's sharp as a tack. She really pressed the respondents on this. She said, if states have so much power over alcohol, why couldn't they just have different tax rates for different products? Like Hawaii tried to do with their local booze.
Right. If it's okay to discriminate based on residency, why not based on where the product comes from?
Exactly. And that really gets to the heart of what the 21st Amendment really allows. Does it give states that much power?
Right.
Then they started digging into the past. They talked about the powers that states had before Prohibition and how the 21st Amendment, which repealed Prohibition, did or didn't change those powers. And they brought up another case, Ziffrin, Inc. v. Reeves. That one was about a state's ability to control how alcohol was transported.
Okay, so more historical precedent to grapple with.
Yeah, and the debate here was whether all of this pre-Prohibition power, maybe bolstered by the 21st Amendment, actually allows for discrimination, specifically in taxes. And the respondent's lawyer argued that Ziffrin didn't support discrimination based on the specific products.
So they're drawing a line saying states might have broad power but not unlimited power to discriminate.
Yeah, it's a very nuanced argument. Then another big case comes up, Granholm v. Heald. This one's a doozy. It was about state laws that let in-state wineries ship directly to consumers, but they either blocked or limited out-of-state wineries from doing the same.
I remember that case. It was all over the news. Wine lovers were up in arms.
Yeah, it was a big deal. And the argument here was that Granholm really focused on discrimination against out-of-state products, not just a general idea that any kind of economic protectionism in the alcohol world is bad.
So it sounds like the court is trying to thread a very fine needle here, figuring out how these different cases fit together and what they tell us about the limits of state power.
Exactly. And Justice Kagan was all over this. She jumped in and questioned the whole foundation of upholding this residency requirement if, at the end of the day, its only real purpose is to give a leg up to businesses that are already in the state.
Makes sense. If it's just about protecting your own, that seems suspect.
Right. And she suggested that the dormant commerce clause, that whole idea of free trade between states, might still apply here.
So we're back to that core tension. State sovereignty versus the free flow of commerce.
Yeah, that's the heart of the matter. And Justice Breyer, he's always thinking historically, brought up the fact that, look, a lot of states have had these residency requirements for a long time. What do we make of that? Does it lend legitimacy to Tennessee's law?
That's a good question. Just because something has been done for a long time doesn't necessarily mean it's right.
Exactly. And the respondent's lawyer actually pushed back on this a bit. They said, well, not that many states have these durational residency requirements like Tennessee's.
So they're trying to narrow the historical argument, saying Tennessee's law is more unique than it might seem at first glance.
Right. Now, the lawyer for the folks challenging the Tennessee law, they wanted to clarify their position. They're not trying to blow up the whole three-tier system of alcohol distribution. You know, that system where producers, wholesalers, and retailers are generally separate entities.
Okay, so they're not going for a complete overhaul of the system.
No, they just want a fair chance to compete within that existing system, especially since their clients already have a substantial physical presence in Tennessee. They're already operating there, just not as liquor retailers.
So it's more of a targeted challenge, focusing on that residency requirement.
Exactly. And Justice Gorsuch, he always likes to think ahead, raised a really interesting question. He said, okay, let's say this residency requirement gets struck down. What's next? Would the next legal challenge be against the entire three-tier system itself, arguing that it's inherently biased against out-of-state businesses?
Oh, wow, that's taking it to a whole new level.
It is. He even drew a parallel to cases about needing a physical presence in a state to collect sales tax.
Yeah, there are some interesting similarities there. Both involve the question of whether a state can use its power to give an advantage to local businesses.
And Justice Breyer, he likes to test the limits of arguments with hypotheticals. So he chimed in and said, okay, could a state force liquor stores to only use products made within the state, like paint, cleaning supplies, that kind of thing? Where does the state's power end?
Right. Those hypotheticals are designed to expose the logical extremes of an argument.
Now, the challengers to the law, they argue that the Tennessee law's real goal was just to protect local businesses, plain and simple. And they said that if the court doesn't buy that, the state hasn't given a good enough reason, like Granholm requires, to justify this rule that clearly seems to discriminate.
So they're saying if it's not pure protectionism, then show us a valid reason for this rule.
Right. They acknowledge that the three-tier system in general, has been seen as okay, but they question why this extra burden of a long residency requirement is really needed on top of that.
Right. Is it truly necessary, or is it just an extra hurdle to keep out competition?
That's the key question. And then finally, the court touched on a really fundamental issue. Does the usual way we analyze laws under the Dormant Commerce Clause even apply when we're dealing with alcohol in the 21st Amendment?
Right, because the 21st Amendment does give states special authority when it comes to alcohol. So does that mean all the regular rules go out the window?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And the state's lawyer wrapped up by saying, look, states have the right to decide who is a resident. And these longer residency rules, they just naturally flow from that basic right. As long as there's some plausible reason for the law, it should be upheld.
So their final argument is, we have the power, we have a reason, case closed.
All right, we've heard both sides. Talk testimonies, time for us to put on our robes and step into the 10th chair.
Oh, I love this part.
If I were sitting up there with the 9 justices, having heard all of those arguments, here's how I'd be thinking about this case. 10th chair perspective. Look, there's no doubt that states have a real interest in regulating alcohol. It's not like selling shoes or books. We're talking about something that can have serious consequences for public health and safety if it's not handled responsibly. The 21st Amendment clearly gives states a lot of authority in this area, and we have to respect that.
I agree. States have a legitimate role to play here, 10th chair perspective. But here's the thing that rubs me the wrong way. This durational residency requirement, particularly that 10-year part, it's just really hard to justify based solely on making sure people run their liquor stores responsibly, right? 10 years seems excessive. 10th chair perspective. If someone is already operating in Tennessee, they're following all the other rules, they've got a physical presence there, why should it matter how long they've lived in the state? That's where it starts to feel a lot like protectionism to me, favoring the established businesses over newcomers. I see your point. 10th chair perspective. And while the 21st Amendment gives states power, it shouldn't be a blank check to engage in economic protectionism that disadvantages businesses from other states without a clear and direct connection to legitimate goals. Right, there has to be a balance. 10th chair perspective. You know, the historical argument is interesting, but things change, and our understanding of the Commerce Clause has evolved to prevent these kinds of barriers to trade between states. So the question I keep coming back to is, does this long residency requirement truly serve a specific purpose related to alcohol control that couldn't be achieved in a less discriminatory way? Or is it mainly about shielding in-state businesses from competition? And honestly, based on what I've heard, I'm leaning towards the latter.
It's a tough one, right? A lot to consider. Well, talk testimonies. That wraps up our deep dive into this Supreme Court case on state alcohol regulations.
That was a wild ride. Lots of twists and turns.
I know, right? We've covered a lot of ground. Residency requirements, the Dormant Commerce Clause, and of course the ever-important 21st Amendment. This case really shows how the court constantly has to grapple with the tension between state authority and the principle of free trade, especially in this unique area of alcohol.
And it makes you wonder, where else might this tension play out? What other industries or areas might see similar challenges based on this balance of power?
Excellent question. That's something to ponder, talk testimonies. What aspects of state power over different industries do you find most intriguing? And what other Supreme Court cases would you like us to break down in future deep dives? Let us know.